Federal agents were told to leave, Canadian officials quietly stepped in, and a small industrial city in Michigan just triggered a national alarm. It's not war, it's not a revolution, but something is changing, and fast, because Michigan isn't acting alone. Across 10 northern states, the border with Canada isn't just a line on a map anymore, it's a lifeline. From trade and energy to healthcare and culture, the ties run deep. In some places, deeper than the connection to Washington District of Columbia itself. And if push comes to shove, these states might not wait for permission to decide their future. So which states are drifting away first? And how close are we to seeing the unthinkable? Michigan. The border's already blurred. Few places within the United States are as deeply enmeshed with a foreign country as this industrial powerhouse of the North. With more than $80 billion in trade exchanged annually, the relationship between Michigan and Canada is not just strong, it is essential. That trade figure alone makes Canada Michigan's largest international partner, a distinction that has significant implications not only for commerce, but also for culture, infrastructure, and identity. Nowhere is this relationship more visible than in the Detroit-Windsor corridor. Though technically separated by the Detroit River, these two cities operate like a single urban ecosystem. Every day, thousands of trucks cross the Ambassador Bridge and Detroit-Windsor Tunnel, transporting everything from vehicle parts to food, chemicals, electronics, and more. The scale of movement is so large that any disruption in this flow can ripple through the entire economy of both countries. The automotive industry is where this dependence reaches its peak. Cars built in Michigan may include transmissions from Ontario, electronics made in Canadian factories, and parts that cross the border multiple times before assembly is complete. These production loops are so interlinked that separating them would not only be inconvenient, it could cripple both sides. The economy here isn't just global, it's binational. But the integration goes beyond commerce. Michigan relies on Canadian infrastructure for power, importing hydroelectricity from Quebec, and depending on pipelines and railways that move energy from Alberta. Bridges, tunnels, and utility networks have been developed collaboratively, turning what might have been national divides into points of union. Historically, this closeness is not a new phenomenon. In the early 19th century, following the Toledo War, a territorial dispute with Ohio, some residents of Michigan expressed interest in joining British Canada. Although the idea never gained momentum, it showed how frustrated some were with the U.S. federal system even then. That undercurrent of independence has never entirely disappeared. Culturally, Michigan's proximity to Canada has led to a shared sensibility, strong labor movements, progressive urban politics, and cross-border communities that live, work, and even marry across national lines. In a future marked by division or disruption, it is not hard to imagine this state rethinking its allegiance. This is just the beginning. What comes next will make you rethink where America ends and Canada begins. Alaska, America's Canadian outpost. This northern giant feels more like a nation unto itself than a traditional state in the Union. Geographically disconnected from the rest of the country, it relies on Canada in ways that are both practical and profound. There is no driving into or out of Alaska without passing through Canadian territory. British Columbia and the Yukon Territory are not just neighbors, they are the lifeline that connects this frozen frontier to the rest of the continent. But the ties run deeper than roads. Fishing, oil, and mineral extraction, the industries that underpin Alaska's economy, are heavily entwined with Canadian partners. In many cases, Canadian companies hold controlling stakes in operations across the state, and it is not uncommon for resources pulled from Alaskan soil to be processed, sold, or shipped through Canadian facilities. That level of cooperation makes national borders feel more like administrative suggestions than meaningful divisions. Energy also plays a critical role in this quiet dependence. While Alaska has its own reserves, distributing those resources efficiently depends on Canadian logistics networks, especially rail lines and ports that move crude oil, liquefied natural gas, and other commodities to world markets. Remove Canada from that equation, and Alaska's economic engine stalls. There is also a massive military dimension to this bond. Under the North American Aerospace Defense Command, formerly known as the Joint Canadian-United States Military Defense Agreement, airspace, radar, and early warning systems are managed collaboratively. This makes Canada and Alaska co-defenders of the North, operating in lockstep against any aerial threat from across the Arctic. Lifestyle and identity mirror this alliance. The people in both regions are defined by isolation, resilience, and respect for wilderness. Snowmobiles, salmon fisheries, and sub-zero winters are part of the daily fabric on both sides of the invisible line. Families living along the border often have dual citizenship, and cross-border marriages, jobs, and education are surprisingly common. Alaska might feel far away, but what about a state right next to Quebec with a real independence movement? Before we jump to the next state, take a second and hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started, because what comes next isn't just historical or hypothetical, it's personal. These states aren't drifting in theory, they're already living like part of Canada in real time. Vermont, the secessionist streak. Nestled in the northeastern United States, Vermont may be known for its picturesque landscapes, maple syrup, and fall foliage, but beneath its tranquil surface lies a quietly rebellious spirit that has never quite faded. This is not just a poetic notion. Vermont is the only state in the United States that was once an independent republic. From the year 1777 to 1791, the territory that would become the Green Mountain State existed outside both British and American control. It was self-governed, self-financed, and fiercely independent, refusing to bend to outside authority until it voluntarily joined the Union as the 14th state. But centuries later, that same independent streak still lingers. A political movement known as the Second Vermont Republic has emerged over the past 2 decades, advocating for the state's peaceful secession from the United States. Although it remains a fringe movement, it has gained enough traction to be noticed on the national stage. Proponents argue that Vermont would thrive on its own, or perhaps more realistically, as part of a country whose values more closely reflect its own, Canada. Culturally and politically, Vermont mirrors its northern neighbor, the Canadian province of Quebec, more than it does many of its fellow American states. Vermont's population consistently supports progressive policies that align with Canadian ideals, particularly in areas like universal health care, environmental regulation, and public education. Social services in the state are robust, and its electorate has proven time and again that it prefers a strong public sector, echoing Canadian political culture far more than the market-driven models favored by Washington District of Columbia. On the economic front, Vermont maintains significant trade ties with Canada. Goods and services flow across the border with relative ease, particularly with Quebec. The tourism sector benefits from Canadian travelers, while cross-border cooperation supports both regional industries and environmental efforts. Vermont's agrarian economy, centered on dairy farms, forestry, and artisanal products, is similar to that of Eastern Canada, and the state's small, tight-knit towns echo the community-based governance seen in rural Canadian provinces. In many ways, Vermont already functions like a northern province. Its size, values, and economy closely parallel those of neighboring Canadian regions. Vermont wants independence, but the next state might not want to be American at all if push comes to shove. New Hampshire, live free or die, meets Canada. Among the 50 states of the United States of America, few embody independence as strongly as New Hampshire. Nestled in the northeastern corner of New England, this small but defiant state has built a legacy around political autonomy and cultural self-reliance. Its motto, "Live free or die," isn't just a historical phrase. It's a living principle, embedded in the policies, economy, and identity of the Granite State. New Hampshire is one of the few states with no personal income tax and no general sales tax. This isn't just fiscal policy, it's a statement of philosophy. Many of its residents are proud of their minimal reliance on federal programs and fiercely support limited government involvement. These views aren't just expressed in personal opinions, they make their way into legislation. In 2022, state lawmakers shocked the nation by introducing a constitutional amendment that would have allowed voters to decide on New Hampshire's secession from the United States. Though it didn't pass, its formal introduction marked a dramatic shift. This wasn't a stunt from a political fringe. It represented real frustration with Washington District of Columbia. But the pull toward independence doesn't exist in a vacuum. New Hampshire shares deep economic and cultural ties with Canada, especially with the neighboring province of Quebec. Trade between the two is vital. Tourism, renewable energy, forestry, and small manufacturing form the backbone of this relationship. In many ways, the state's economy is already integrated with Canada's. Even politically, New Hampshire's decentralized approach to governance bears similarities to Canada's model of strong provincial autonomy. Some Granite Staters see more of their ideals reflected in Ottawa's respect for local control than in Washington's federal mandates. Culturally, too, the state aligns with its northern neighbors. Outdoor recreation, winter sports, maple syrup farming, and bilingual communities are just a few shared elements. French-speaking populations and families with Canadian roots are common in northern towns. Movements like the Free State Project, pushing for libertarian ideals and reduced federal influence, further illustrate this push for autonomy. While not directly advocating for joining Canada, the parallels are hard to ignore. From the Northeast, our journey now shifts westward, toward another state whose residents don't just connect with Canada. They live like they are already part of it. Minnesota. The Midwestern Canadian? Often overlooked in national conversations, this northern state quietly shares an astonishing number of similarities with its neighbor to the north. At first glance, it may seem like an unlikely candidate for any sort of geopolitical shift, but look a little deeper, and the signs become impossible to ignore. To begin with, Minnesota and Canada share an extensive 550-mile border. That's not just a political line, it's a living, breathing corridor of economic exchange, shared ecosystems, and deeply intertwined communities. For decades, people, goods, and services have flowed across this border with ease. It is not uncommon for families in northern Minnesota to have relatives living just across the divide in the Canadian provinces of Manitoba or Ontario. In some cases, these family ties go back generations, and the sense of cross-border unity is strong. Economically, the bond is even more compelling. Canada is Minnesota's single largest trading partner. In the year 2023 alone, Minnesota exported more than $7 billion worth of goods to Canada, making the connection not just sentimental, but essential to the state's prosperity. This robust exchange includes agricultural products, medical technology, manufactured goods, and raw materials. Many Minnesotan businesses rely on Canadian partnerships and supply chains that are deeply rooted in long-standing agreements and logistical infrastructure. Culturally, the similarities are undeniable. Both Minnesota and much of Canada share a love for winter sports, especially ice hockey. The Minnesota nice reputation parallels the famously polite Canadian demeanor. The thick northern accents, the communal love for ice fishing, and the shared emphasis on social welfare and public services all point to a cultural overlap that's more than coincidental. The historical backdrop adds another layer. Before Minnesota officially became a state in the year 1858, much of the region was tied to the British-controlled fur trade. The Hudson's Bay Company, a Canadian institution, operated throughout the area that is now northern Minnesota. If Minnesota already feels Canadian, the next state might be even more reliant on its northern neighbor, not just in spirit, but in order to function at all. Maine, powered by Canada, literally. In the far northeastern corner of the United States lies Maine, a state whose lifeblood flows not only through its rugged coastlines and pine-covered hills, but directly across the Canadian border. Though unmistakably part of New England, Maine operates with a quiet but profound dependency on its northern neighbors, especially the provinces of Quebec and New Brunswick. Nowhere is this more evident than in the state's energy supply. A significant portion of Maine's electricity comes from Hydro-Quebec, making Canada not just a partner, but a provider of essential infrastructure. Without this steady stream of clean, hydroelectric power, many of Maine's towns would face immediate shortfalls. Washington District of Columbia talks about energy transition. Maine already lives it thanks to a foreign grid. But the relationship extends well beyond utilities. Culturally and economically, Maine and New Brunswick are mirror images. Generations of seafaring, shipbuilding, and fishing have forged a shared identity. In towns along the St. Croix River, you'd be hard-pressed to tell which side of the border you're on. Homes fly both flags. Restaurants serve the same Acadian dishes, and French is spoken as freely as English in northern communities. Trade between Maine and Canada exceeds $3 billion annually. Trucks move lumber, seafood, and agricultural goods daily across the border. Canadian license plates are a common sight in Portland, Bangor, and even in rural towns. For local businesses, cutting ties with Canada would be unthinkable. It would be economic suicide. Even politically, Maine charts a different course from many southern or Midwestern states. It leans toward healthcare access, environmental regulation, and public education. Stances far more aligned with Canadian policy than with Washington's gridlock. Some have even called it the most Canadian state in the Union. This cultural alignment plays out in everyday life. In Madawaska, residents regularly cross into Edmundston, New Brunswick, for church, medical visits, groceries, or family gatherings. Some Americans even hold dual citizenship. And when it comes to healthcare, many northern Mainers cross the border not just by choice, but by necessity. It's cheaper, it's familiar, and for some, it's better. In a time of increasing political polarization, Maine stands out not just as a border state, but as a border bridge. If lines were ever redrawn, this one might not move far. It's already halfway there. North Dakota, the quiet integration. On the vast windswept plains of the upper Midwest sits a state that, despite its quiet demeanor, leans heavily on a foreign lifeline. North Dakota may be steeped in American imagery, oil rigs, wheat fields, and rugged individualism, but beneath that patriotic exterior lies a surprising truth. Its future may be more entangled with Canada than with Washington, District of Columbia. Economically, the bond is undeniable. North Dakota exports over $6 billion in goods to Canada annually, making it the state's top international trading partner by a wide margin. This trade stretches across multiple sectors, from agriculture and heavy machinery to petroleum and construction materials. Farmers depend on Canadian markets to absorb vast quantities of wheat, soybeans, and corn. At the same time, manufacturers rely on Canadian components to keep operations running. Many of these cross-border supply chains aren't new. They've been in place for decades. Energy adds another layer of connection. Despite North Dakota's own oil boom in the Bakken Formation, the state remains deeply tied to Canadian energy firms and infrastructure. Pipelines, utility partnerships, and Canadian investment in local energy operations form a tightly knit network. If these links were suddenly cut, the shockwaves would be immediate and severe. In border towns like Portal, Dunseith, and Pembina, daily life makes this international connection even more personal. It's common for families to live on one side of the border and work, shop, or receive healthcare on the other. In these communities, the Canadian border isn't a barrier, it's a bridge, culturally and politically. North Dakota and the Canadian Prairie provinces speak the same language of rural resilience. Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. They share North Dakota's small government ethos, agricultural backbone, and community-first mentality. In fact, serious discussions were once held about forming a cross-border economic region with Manitoba, a concept rooted in shared economic interests and regional identity. This regional closeness extends into local governance and crisis response. During health emergencies or natural disasters, it's not unusual for assistance to come from the north before it arrives from Washington. Some counties even coordinate emergency services directly with their Canadian counterparts. North Dakota may not fly the maple leaf yet, but in practice, it is already straddling two worlds. In the event of a national fracture, political, economic, or environmental, it would not take much for the state to slide further toward its northern partner. Oregon, Cascadia, rising. Along the windswept Pacific coast, Oregon has long been known for its independent streak, rooted in environmental stewardship, civic innovation, and progressive values. But beneath the surface of its evergreen forests and socially conscious cities, a quiet shift is taking place. Some are beginning to ask a provocative question: should Oregon's future be tied to the United States or to Canada? This is not just ideological speculation. Oregon trades over $4 billion United States dollars worth of goods with Canada each year, making its northern neighbor a critical economic partner, from forestry and agriculture to clean tech and manufacturing. The cross-border relationship is deep and essential. British Columbia, in particular, plays a central role. The province and Oregon share not only a coastline, but a vision of sustainable development, international cooperation, and economic resilience. The alignment is also clear in public policy. Oregon and British Columbia both lead on climate legislation, carbon pricing, and investments in renewable energy. In many cases, Oregon's laws more closely mirror those in Canada than in many other American states. Whether it's clean air standards, urban design, or public transportation, the Pacific Northwest often feels like its own political ecosystem, one far more in tune with Ottawa than Washington, District of Columbia. This internal contrast is further sharpened by movements like Greater Idaho, which seeks to shift rural Oregon counties into the jurisdiction of Idaho in protest of liberal state policies. While the East looks inland for representation, the West, the urban coastal half of the state, quietly glances north. Cities like Portland and Eugene share more political DNA with Vancouver, British Columbia, than with Boise or Salt Lake City. Nowhere is this kinship more visible than between Portland and Vancouver. Despite being separated by an international border, the two cities share a dedication to inclusivity, sustainability, cycling infrastructure, and progressive governance. Some researchers even consider them part of the unofficial Cascadian Corridor, a bioregion where political boundaries feel increasingly obsolete. For now, the idea of Oregon realigning with Canada remains theoretical, discussed in academic circles and activist forums. But in a time of national polarization and growing cultural divides, it reflects a deeper question: what happens when a region's values outgrow its nation? Let's now head east to a place where the US-Canada connection is even more entrenched, both physically and politically. Washington, the Canadian future state. Tucked along the northwestern edge of the continental United States, Washington state stands out, not just for its towering pine forests, innovative cities, and tech-fueled economy, but for how deeply its identity seems to align with the country just beyond its northern border. In more ways than one, Washington operates less like a remote U.S. state and more like Canada's cultural and economic sibling. The numbers say it all. In the year 2023, trade between Washington and Canada topped $20 billion United States dollars, making Canada the state's most important international partner by far. This isn't limited to a single industry. Exports and imports range from aerospace parts and cloud computing services to lumber, agriculture, and clean tech. Major corridors like the Pacific Gateway and the Can-Am Highway turn cross-border commerce into a daily rhythm, not a diplomatic gesture. Energy is another pillar. Washington's hydroelectric grid is closely linked with British Columbia's. Clean energy from Canadian sources flows into Washington's system, reducing emissions and reinforcing shared climate goals. The collaboration here isn't just practical, it's symbolic of two regions prioritizing sustainability over short-term gain. Washington also aligns politically with Canada, more than it does with many parts of the United States. Universal healthcare, labor protections, climate action, and green taxation, all central themes in Canadian governance, have deep roots in Washington as well. Cities like Seattle and Olympia champion policies that echo those of Vancouver and Victoria more closely than they do any American capital east of the Rockies. Culturally, the cross-border overlap is striking. Both regions prize diversity, environmental preservation, and public land access. The Cascades and the Coast Mountains are shared backyards, whether it's the love of outdoor recreation, craft coffee, or sustainable urban planning. British Columbia and Washington often feel like two sides of the same coin. Perhaps the boldest idea linking them is the proposed high-speed rail connecting Seattle and Vancouver. If built, it would unite the cities in under 2 hours, creating a Pacific mega-region that transcends national borders and redefines what cross-border integration looks like. Washington isn't actively pursuing secession, but in an age of federal dysfunction and global realignments, one thing is clear. If any state is already living like part of Canada, it's Washington. But what happens when that overlap is not just economic or political, but historical, geographical, and emotional? Montana, the prairie twin. Framed by towering peaks and vast prairies, Montana stands as a state whose identity often feels more in step with Western Canada than with Washington, District of Columbia. Along its extensive northern border, Montana touches 3 Canadian provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia, forming a natural connection that has matured into a deeply rooted relationship across trade, culture, and lifestyle. Economically, that bond is undeniable. In the year 2023, Montana exported more than 700 million United States dollars in goods to Canada, from wheat and cattle to lumber and energy resources. These cross-border exchanges form the backbone of many rural economies. For small towns on both sides of the border, this isn't auxiliary income, it's survival. Without Canadian buyers and suppliers, dozens of Montana communities would feel an immediate economic hit, but the ties don't stop with trade. In many parts of Montana, particularly in rural regions, there's a strong undercurrent of self-governance and skepticism toward federal control. That sentiment resonates with the decentralized model of governance found in Canada, where provinces hold significant autonomy. To many Montanans, Ottawa feels less intrusive than Washington, which often seems distant and disconnected from the values of landowners, ranchers, and small-town families. The cultural alignment is equally compelling. Outdoor living isn't a pastime, it's a way of life. Whether it's elk hunting, fly fishing, snowmobiling, or tending ranches through brutal winters, Montana and Alberta share more than just a border. They share a mindset, one built on resilience, community, and independence. Even urban centers like Calgary and Missoula exhibit similarities in values and priorities, emphasizing local control, resource-based economies, and a deep respect for nature. The historical roots go back even further. Long before Montana became a state, Canadian fur traders and explorers moved through its rivers and mountain passes. Those early routes evolved into modern highways and economic corridors that still shape cross-border commerce today. The term Montana began as a tongue-in-cheek nickname, but as national polarization deepens and federal priorities feel increasingly misaligned, the idea takes on a more serious tone. In today's volatile political climate, Montanans may soon face a quiet yet profound question. If your values, economy, and lifestyle already match your neighbors to the north, why not take the next step? In an era where political lines blur, Montana's path may not lead east, it might just point north. So what do you think? Is this just political theater, or are we watching the quiet start of a continental realignment? Could Canada be the next home for states like Montana, Washington, and Vermont? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. And if this video made you see the map a little differently, give it a like and hit that subscribe button.